As the new year approached, Irish Americans opened their newspapers hoping to read about the launch of the long-promised uprising. Stevens, however, was still nowhere to be found. In early December, the New York Times reported that he was spotted in Paris. Stevens, however, wasn't on the other side of the ocean. He wasn't even on the other side of Manhattan. In reality, he had gone underground, just as he did after faking his death during the Young Irelander Rebellion. Using the alias William Scott, he was living 50 blocks south of where he was last seen in public, in a modest room at 308 East 13th Street. On December 15th, he summoned a meeting of 30 top advisers. Looking haggard and ill after an attack of dyspepsia, Stevens grew angry at the pitiful state of military preparations when Colonel Thomas Kelly reported that the Fenians had less than 1/4 of the minimum 30,000 rifles needed for the uprising. "I found that matters were even worse than my apprehensions," Stevens recalled. Confronted with the harsh reality of the Fenians' lack of money and weapons, Stevens announced that he needed to break his promise. There would be no revolution in 1866. Ireland would have to wait again. The decision infuriated his advisers, who had grown exhausted with his habitual hesitation and increasingly saw him solely as a speechmaker and fundraiser. At a subsequent meeting, when Stevens refused to share his military plan for the invasion, Captain John McCafferty even pulled out a pistol and pointed it at the Fenian chief. The military men effectively deposed Stevens. He had vowed to either fight or dissolve the Brotherhood in 1865, but 1867 had arrived with no action. He had opted again to not take the shot. Kelly now took charge of the plan for the uprising. To Fenian military men like Kelly, 700 years had been long enough to wait. They refused to spend yet another year under the British yoke. If Stevens refused to deliver on his promises, they would. Kelly, McCafferty, and other Fenian military leaders set sail from New York on January 12th, but Stevens missed the boat. The Fenian chief claimed that he had been a victim of a deplorable trick because the ship departed 2 hours earlier than he had been told, although a wounded ego and an empty wallet were more likely to blame. It took Stevens several weeks to raise the money to pay for passage to Paris, but he could not afford transit on to England or Ireland, so he remained in France. Stevens would no longer play a central role in the Irish Republican Brotherhood. The grizzled patriot who had rekindled Irish nationalism and erected the transatlantic partnership with the diaspora had spent nearly a decade leading the Irish revolutionary movement. Such longevity in office testified to his leadership skills, but of course it also reflected his inability to achieve his goal of overthrowing British rule on the island of his birth. The IRB leader ultimately proved too cautious for his followers. They wanted a man of action. Stevens wasn't one of them. Kelly pressed ahead with plans from his new operational base in London, where he established the Provisional Government of the Irish Republic and assumed the role of chief executive. On March 5, 1867, he launched the long-awaited Fenian Rising. A messenger delivered the Fenians' proclamation of the Irish Republic, which had been drafted by Kelly and his fellow officers, to the Times in London. The manifesto was a radical, republican, and secular document that called for the separation of church and state, universal suffrage, and absolute liberty of conscience. "We have suffered centuries of outrage, enforced poverty, and bitter misery," read the document. "Our rights and liberties have been trampled on by an alien aristocracy, who, treating us as foes, usurped our lands and drew away from our unfortunate country all material riches. The real owners of the soil were removed to make room for cattle, and driven across the ocean to seek the means of living, and the political rights denied to them at home, while our men of thought and action were condemned to loss of life and liberty." That night, Republicans sought to repossess what rightly belonged to them. The rebels launched scattered attacks on Coast Guard posts, police stations, and military barracks. In Cork, over 1,000 Irishmen marched into the countryside to confront the British. The most serious fighting occurred in the village of Tallaght, southwest of Dublin, where a few hundred Fenians exchanged gunfire with a small force of constables, resulting in the deaths of 2 rebels.